The Defense Department reported today that sexual assaults in the military were up 50% last year, an increase attributed to Pentagon efforts to encourage victims to report the crimes, not an increase in the actual number of assaults. Here's a little of what Major General Jeffrey Snow told reporters at the Pentagon.
For those of you that have been a victim of this crime, I want you to know that we are working very hard to establish a climate where these assaults do not happen. If you have been a victim, please, please reach out to your local SARC victim advocate, a healthcare professional, or the Department of Defense Safe Helpline. We want you to get the support you need. You will be treated with the privacy you desire, the sensitivity you deserve, and the seriousness that this crime demands. To the offenders committing this crime, we don't care who you are or what rank you hold. If you don't understand our core values and are not prepared to live by and enforce those values every day, then we don't want you in our military.
All of that Defense Department briefing will be on C-SPAN 2 in a few minutes. On Capitol Hill, the House Oversight Committee held a hearing on the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, Libya, that killed 4 Americans, including Ambassador Christopher Stevens. Chairman Darrell Issa said that the White House withholding information about the attack was, quote, perhaps criminal. That hearing is coming up in a few moments. House Speaker John Boehner is calling on Secretary of State John Kerry to testify before Congress about why emails dealing with the 2012 Benghazi attack were not given to congressional investigators. In a statement, the Speaker said the White House needs to understand that this investigation will not end until the entire truth is revealed and justice and accountability are served. And when asked about today's hearing on the Libya attack, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi said, quote, what I will say again is diversion, subterfuge, Benghazi, Benghazi, Benghazi. Why aren't we talking about something else? She added that what she read about administration emails on the subject were consistent with what was previously released. We'll hear more about those emails in Oversight Committee Chairman Darrell Issa's opening statement in a minute. At that hearing, the general in charge of the U.S. military's Africa Command during the Benghazi attack told the committee that the military knew it was a, quote, hostile action and should have tried to rescue the Americans there. The USA Today writes this contradicts what the Obama administration said in the early days after the attacks, that the attacks were a spontaneous reaction to an anti-Islam video. And we see a picture there of a guard standing outside the U.S. Consulate in Benghazi in 2012, just days after the attacks. We're going to watch the 2-hour hearing now. Chairman Issa is getting ready to gavel in the hearing and give his opening statement.
The Committee on Government Oversight will come to order. Today's hearing on Benghazi, instability and a new government, successes and failures of U.S. intervention in Libya. The Oversight Committee's mission statement is that we exist to secure 2 fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers. It's our job to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is our mission. Today, the Oversight Committee convenes a 4th hearing related to the security situation in Libya before, during, and after the September 11th terrorist attack in Benghazi, which claimed the lives of 4 Americans. The committee has previously brought forward important witnesses who offered new, enlightening testimony on security failures that forced the administration to walk back false claims about the nature of the terrorist attack. The testimony of previous witnesses also identified key questions in the interagency process that only this committee has the jurisdiction and the charge to investigate. While much of the committee's effort in the investigation has focused on the Department of State, we have recently conducted several joint interviews of relevant military personnel with the House Armed Services Committee. Well, we had requested that these interviews be conducted as unclassified. The Pentagon leadership insisted that they occur at the inexplicable and unreasonable level of top secret. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have called for an end to this investigation. These calls are clearly premature and only raise public concerns about the political agenda to stop an important investigation before it is completed gathering facts about this interagency Obama administration debacle. In particular, the committee seeks insight into communications and directions that flowed between the State Department, the Department of Defense, and, yes, the White House. It is essential that we fully understand areas of responsibility before, during, and after the attacks. It's my hope that today's hearing will help us add to our investigation's expanding body of knowledge, and I'm pleased that we will be proceeding on an entirely unclassified basis. We do so because the American people, more than anyone else in this body, have the absolute right to know why 4 men are dead in an attack that could have been prevented. Today we have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today that will bring expertise to us about the current situation in Libya. One of our witnesses, retired United States Air Force Brigadier General Robert Lovell, brings with him firsthand knowledge of U.S. military efforts in Libya as he served at U.S. African Command. U.S. African Command is sometimes called AFRICOM. In the military command lingo, this is the organization that had responsibility not just for Libya, but for the entire continent of Africa. This unit's mission included both the Libyan Revolution and the September 11, 2012 terrorist attack on a diplomatic compound in Benghazi. At the U.S. African Command, General Lovell served as the Deputy Director for Intelligence and Knowledge Development and as Deputy Commanding General of Joint Task Force Odyssey Guard. In this assignment, he was tasked with helping the State Department reopen the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli after the fall of Gaddafi. We appreciate all of our witnesses taking time to testify and enlighten the public about the situation in Libya and the effects of U.S. decisions. In addition to pursuing the relevant information about the military's involvement in Libya, we continue to receive documents from the State Department. Since late March alone, we have received over 3,200 new documents, many of which have never been seen before by anyone outside of the administration, and all of which, and I repeat, all of which should have been turned over more than a year and a half ago when the committee launched its investigation. Some of these documents, which were brought to light only days ago through a FOIA request by an organization known as Judicial Watch, show a direct White House role outside, I'm going to repeat this, the documents from Judicial Watch's FOIA, which were pursuant to our request more than a year and a half ago, show a direct White House role outside of talking points prepared by the intelligence community. The White House produced the talking points that Ambassador Rice used, not the intelligence community. In pushing the false narrative that a YouTube video was responsible for the deaths of 4 brave Americans. It is disturbing and perhaps criminal that documents like these were hidden by the Obama administration from Congress and the public alike, particularly after Secretary Kerry pledged cooperation and the President himself told the American people in November of 2012 that, quote, "Every bit of information we have on Benghazi has been provided." This committee's job is to get to the facts and to the truth. I, for one, will continue to chip away at this until we get the whole truth. The Americans who lost their lives in Benghazi, those who were wounded, and the American people deserve nothing less. So today's hearing is critical for what our witnesses will give us, and I welcome you and I thank you for being here. But it comes in a week in which the American people have learned that you cannot believe what the White House says, you cannot believe what the spokespeople say, and you cannot believe what the President says, and the facts are coming out that in fact this administration has knowingly withheld documents pursuant to congressional subpoenas in violation of any reasonable transparency or historic precedent, at least since Richard Milhouse Nixon. I now recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
I thank the Chairman for yielding, and thank you for this hearing. In 2011, the people of Libya rose up against their dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, to end his oppressive rule, which lasted more than 4 decades. At the time, Republicans and Democrats alike strongly supported helping armed rebels in their efforts to overthrow Gaddafi. For example, in April 2011, Senator John McCain traveled to Libya and met with the rebels, after which he proclaimed, and I quote, "They are my heroes." During a national television appearance on July 3rd, 2011, Senator McCain warned that allowing Gaddafi to remain in power would be far more dangerous to the United States than the alternative. He stated, and I quote, "This notion that we should fear who comes after or what comes after Gaddafi ignores that if Gaddafi stays in power, it is then a direct threat to our national security," end of quote. During a television appearance on April 24, 2011, Senator Lindsey Graham agreed that taking the fight directly to Gaddafi would protect our national security. He stated, and I quote, "You cannot protect our vital national security interests if Gaddafi stays," end of quote. He also stated, and I quote, "The focus should now be to cut the head of the snake off," end of quote. As the revolution grew stronger, Gaddafi embarked on a brutal crackdown, and on March 17, 2011, he threatened his own people and warned that he would show them, quote, "no mercy," end of quote. The next day, President Obama explained to the world why the United States was joining the effort to remove Gaddafi, and he said this: "The world has watched events unfold in Libya with hope and alarm. Last month, protesters took to the streets across the country to demand their universal rights and a government that is accountable to them and responsive to their aspirations. But they were met with an iron fist. Instead of respecting the rights of his own people, Gaddafi chose the path of brutal suppression. Innocent civilians were beaten, imprisoned, and in some cases killed." Senator McCain applauded the President's decision, by the way. During a press conference in Libya, he stated, and I quote, "Had President Obama and our allies not acted, history would have remembered Benghazi in the same breath as former Yugoslavia, a scene of mass atrocities and a source of international shame." End of quote. In an op-ed in April 2011, Senator McCain wrote this: "The President was right to intervene. He now deserves our support as we and our coalition partners do all that is necessary to help the Libyan people secure a future freedom." End of quote. In October 2011, Gaddafi finally met his ugly demise. During his oppressive rule, he was an extremely dangerous tyrant. During the 1980s, he supported international terrorism, including the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, which claimed the lives of 270 innocent civilians. He also reportedly pursued chemical, nuclear, and biological weapons. In fact, after Gaddafi was killed, the new Libyan government reportedly uncovered 2 tons of chemical weapons that Gaddafi had kept hidden from the world, yet armed and ready to use. As we all know, a dedicated and patriotic special envoy named Christopher Stevens arrived in Benghazi to work with the Libyan people on their transition to democracy. He had forged deep connections and affiliations with the Libyan people during his career, and he understood the challenges caused by 40 years of oppression. Ambassador Stevens believed in the promise of a new future for this country. Today, Libya is at a crossroads. Open a newspaper and you will read about persistent violence in a country awash in weapons and a central government that has not yet consolidated its control over the country. On the other hand, the Libyan people continue to look to the West with respect and with hope. They aspire to work with the United States to build a stable, pro-democratic country. If we want the people of Libya to succeed, we must find a way to re-engage the world and ourselves on behalf of a nation that desires our help. This was the bipartisan goal shared by Republicans like Lindsey Graham and John McCain, who called on the United States, and I quote, "to build a partnership with a democratic and pro-American Libya that contributes to the expansion of security, prosperity, and freedom across a pivotal region at a time of revolutionary change." End of quote. I hope today is a step towards this goal. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how we can assist the people of Libya. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
I thank the gentleman. All members may have 7 days in which to submit opening statements for the record and any quotes of Senator Lindsey Graham or John McCain they wish. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have 4 documents I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record. One is from the Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, entitled "Lessons from Libya, How Not to Intervene," dated September 2013. Another is an Associated Press article of March 22, 2014, entitled "Libya's Guns, Free-for-All Fuels Region's Turmoil." Another one is the Global Research, April 5, 2014. Headline is "NATO's Humanitarian Intervention in Libya, Transforming a Country into a Failed State." The final one is a document that's listed as unclassified. It's a State Department document previously referenced by Congressman Trey Gowdy. The subject line is "Libya Update from Beth Jones." The date is September 12th at 12:46 p.m. There's a paragraph in here that I think is pertinent to our discussions today. It's referencing the Libyan ambassador when he said his government suspected that former Gaddafi regime elements carried out the attacks. I told him that the group that conducted the attacks, Ansar al-Sharia, is affiliated with Islamic extremists, end quote. This coming from the State Department, going to Victoria Nuland, Patrick Kennedy, Cheryl Mills, Secretary Clinton's Chief of Staff, I'd like to enter this into the record, which has not been out there in the public in the past.
One question. What was the date and time on that?
Date is September 12, 2012, 12:46 p.m. This is hours after the attack. It is what the State Department told the Libyan government what was happening. Quote, "I told him," meaning the Libyan ambassador, "that the group that conducted the attacks, Ansar al-Sharia, is affiliated with Islamic extremists." Those were the facts as the State Department knew them, and I think everybody should see them.
Without objection, so ordered, and copies will be distributed to all members on the dais. We now welcome our guest and witnesses. Brigadier General Robert Lovell is the former Deputy Director for Intelligence and Knowledge Development Directorate at United States African Command and the former Deputy Commanding General of Joint Task Force Odyssey Guard. Ms. Corey Shockey, Ph.D., is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. Mr. David Gostin Ross, Ph.D., is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Frederick Wary is a Ph.D., is a senior associate for Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. General, your title's impressive, but they're all doctorates. Pursuant to the rules, if all witnesses would please rise to take the oath and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow sufficient time for questions, I would ask that each witness summarize their opening statements, which will be placed in the record in the entirety, in addition to other extraneous material you may want to submit as a result of this hearing, but please try to stay close to the 5 minutes. And as my predecessor, Mr. Towns, often said, green means go everywhere, yellow means hurry up through the intersection, and red means stop. So please observe that on the little countdown clocks. And with that, General, you're recognized. General,
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And for all the witnesses, pull your mics close to you when you speak, because they're fairly insensitive in that sense. Thank you, General.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Minority Member, and members of the committee. I retired this past year after 33+ years of service. My service began in 1979 upon enlistment in the United States Air Force. It's also been my honor and privilege to serve as an officer since earning my commission in 1985. Throughout these years, I've served with many brave and distinguished men and women, both uniformed and civilian. I thank them for their service and their example. My time in service was filled with many great and humbling opportunities. I'm thankful for these as well. Over the span of my career, I've been shaped by professional education, training, and experience. These and other personal influences have formed my thoughts on today's subject. To present a sense of context, here's a brief outline of my previous service most relevant at hand. The Chairman's already covered some. What I'd like to add is, as an AFRICOM plank holder, I twice served in Africa Command, first as a colonel, as the NRO representative to the command, and next as a general officer as the Deputy Director of Intelligence and Knowledge Development Division. Additionally, I served as a JOC Watch Officer for Joint Operations Center during Odyssey Dawn and Operation Unified Protector. And in addition to that, I also served as the Senior Military Liaison to National Science Foundation. That's relevant since the Science Foundation was also an interagency partner. That greatly influenced my views on how interagency partnership works. My theme of 3 topics are submitted in my written statement. First topic, U.S.-Africa Command and the interagency nature of that command. Second, military operations with regard to Libya. It discusses strategy, supporting policy, and policy in a highly dynamic and limiting, can be highly dynamic and limit strategy when it's challenged to achieve a desired result. Benghazi in 2012. This is the most serious of the themes. There are many sayings in the military. One saying that rings most true is, you fight the way you train. And in Benghazi we did. Many with firsthand knowledge have recounted the heroism displayed by the brave Americans in Benghazi that night. They fought the way they trained. That's in the record. Outside of Libya, there were discussions that churned on about what we should do. These elements also fought the way they were trained. Specifically, the predisposition to interagency influence had the military structure in the spirit of expeditionary government support, waiting for a request for assistance from the State Department. There are accounts of time, space, and capability, discussions of the question, could we have gotten there in time to make a difference? Well, the discussion is not could or could not of time, space, and capability. The point is we should have tried. As another saying goes, always move to the sound of the guns. We didn't know how long this would last when we became aware of the distress, nor did we completely understand what we had in front of us, be it a kidnapping, rescue, recovery, protracted hostile engagement, or any or all of the above. But what we did know quite early on was that this was a hostile action. This was no demonstration gone terribly awry. To the point of what happened, the facts led to the conclusion of a terrorist attack. The AFRICOM J2 was focused on attribution. The attacks became attributable very soon after the event. Thank you for the invitation to appear before this committee. I'm here because I take this matter very seriously. I'm prepared to take your questions.
Thank you, General. Ms. Shaki.
So I think the starting point for a conversation about Libya is that this is a failing state, right? Security is eroding, governance is ebbing, and as a result of those two things, Libya is unable to capitalize on its one big advantage, which is the oil revenue on which its economy is predominantly based. And unless we are uninterested in this outcome, both for Libyans themselves and from the threats that are emanating to us from them, American policies should actually work to strengthen security in Libya and to strengthen governance in Libya so that the economy can help buffer the transition period of a fragile democratizing government. Our policies are not doing that. Our policies are principally interested in limiting our involvement, and as a result of that, the problems inherent in all transitioning societies and societies that have lived 40 years under repressive governments and had dysfunctional economies, they need structured assistance and help. The United States knows how to do that in terms of security sector reform, in terms of governance, and yet we helped overthrow a government without helping establish security or governance. We have largely ignored the growing restiveness of militia in Libya and the migration of jihadists to Libya, where, you know, the jihadists are now in possession of a Libyan government military base less than 20 miles from the capital. And in overtaking that base, they also got some pretty valuable American military equipment, which we are going to be seeing in Syria, in Libya, and even in our own country unless we really help manage the problem of jihadism in Libya and elsewhere. Building government capacity is the key to doing that. That is, we cannot expect that the Libyan government is going to be able to disarm militia or to control the spread of jihadism in their territory. And that will be the result of political negotiation. It cannot lead political negotiation because militia will not disarm until they have a high level of confidence that the reasons, the political vacuum that exists in Libya is actually going to be managed by political means. The Libyans are having a very messy, very slow, one step forward, one step back conversation about governance in their country. But this is what democratization looks like, and they deserve an awful lot more help from us and from non-governmental institutions that the United States supports, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute. Instead, we have been largely silent on an election that was marred by violence and in which, you know, yesterday's parliamentary vote in Tripoli was prevented from coming to conclusion by storming of the parliament by armed men. As Mr. Cummings said, we need to do all that is necessary to help the Libyan government transition, and we are not. The last thing I would say is that if American policies won't help this fragile government transition to establish security and governance, that we ought actually to encourage other states to do so. States in the region that can situate it politically amongst its neighbors, or states from outside the country. And predominantly, this administration's policies have criticized both the motives and the actions of others instead of encouraging them into avoid our own policies are leaving.
Thank you. Dr. Gartenstein-Ross.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, distinguished members, it's an honor to appear before you to discuss the successes and failures of the NATO intervention in Libya. 2 days ago, it seemed that we were seeing rare good news out of Libya. Oil exports were about to resume from the Zaytuna port after rebels holding it had come to an agreement with the government. On another optimistic note, the interim parliament had convened to select a new prime minister. The previous prime minister had resigned after only 6 days after his family was attacked. The prime minister before him was actually kidnapped by rebels. But the prime minister vote didn't go well. Gunmen stormed the parliamentary building and forced lawmakers to abandon their plans. This is Libya today. Each step forward seems to produce another step or two back, usually driven by security problems. The central government can't execute basic sovereign functions in its own capital building. Last year, gunmen shut down the ministries of Justice and Foreign Affairs for 2 weeks due to a political dispute, the equivalent of gunmen here shutting down the departments of Justice and State. Outside countries are questioning whether it's safe to even keep diplomats in Libya. Jordan's ambassador was kidnapped last month. 2 Tunisian diplomats are being held by jihadists, and there have been many other attacks on embassies and diplomatic staff. I need not remind anyone here of what happened to our own Ambassador Stevens. I've submitted 15 pages of written testimony explaining at some length why I conclude that the costs of NATO's intervention in Libya outweigh the benefits. It's worth acknowledging that the war was superbly executed. NATO responded with extraordinary speed to the situation and saved the lives that Gaddafi would have taken had he overrun Benghazi, the rebel stronghold that he was threatening when the intervention began. This was accomplished with no Allied casualties at only a $1.1 billion cost. But the question remains, was going to war in Libya the right choice? I would suggest that the strategy of intervention should be called into question. Several advocates of military action argued that the Arab Spring had stalled at the time, and that intervening could help breathe new life and new momentum into the revolutionary events. The desire to see dictators fall is, of course, noble, but noble intentions do not automatically make for wise actions. NATO's intervention came when there was already wrenching changes and an unpredictable regional situation. The Tunisian and Egyptian leaders had fallen, and there were other revolutionary rumblings. Intervening represented not just a decision to stop Gaddafi's advance, but also to speed up the pace of change. The problems associated with speeding up events can be seen in the intervention's second-order consequences. The most well-known occurred in North Mali, where a collection of al-Qaeda-linked jihadists, including al-Qaeda's North African affiliate and Tuareg separatist groups, gained control over broad swaths of territory, prompting a French-led intervention in January 2013. Mali's Tuareg rebellion has a long history, but Gaddafi's overthrow transformed the dynamics. Libya's dictator had been a longtime supporter of Tuareg separatism, and with him gone, the Tuaregs had lost a major patron. Jihadist groups exploited the Tuaregs' loss of Gaddafi. There were other ways that NATO's intervention contributed to the jihadist takeover in Mali. Thousands of Tuareg rebels fought for Gaddafi as mercenaries, and after the dictator's defeat, they raided his weapons caches. Their heavily armed return to Mali reinvigorated a long-standing rebellion. The French military intervention pushed the jihadists from areas that they controlled, but there are signs that now, a year later, the jihadists may be back, and indeed, southern Libya has played a role in their comeback. Fighters from Ansar al-Din and al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb fled from advancing French and Allied forces into southwest Libya and blended with local militants. Jihadists in North Africa have also been able to gain from the situation in Libya. A variety of jihadist groups operate training camps there. Militants have benefited from the flow of arms into neighboring countries, and these factors make Libya a concern as a possible staging ground for future terrorist attacks, something vividly illustrated in the January 2013 hostage crisis at Algeria's In Amenas gas plant, 30 miles from the Libya-Algeria border, which had multiple links to Libya, including training, weapons, and point of origin. Despite the superb execution of NATO's intervention, it has created a much more complicated regional dynamic for the U.S. It has helped jihadist groups, and it has had negative consequences for Libya's neighbors. Further, it isn't clear that the intervention saved lives. Some scholars, including in the Belfer Center document that Representative Chafez introduced, argue that the fact that the NATO intervention prolonged the war meant that on net it cost more lives than it saved. And even if it saved lives in Libya, further lives were lost as a result in places like Mali, Egypt, and Algeria. This is why I cannot join with those who proclaim NATO's intervention to be a strategic success. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Wary.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and distinguished committee members, I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak with you about Libya's security crisis and what the international community can do to assist. I bring the perspective of both a scholar who travels frequently to the country and a reserve military officer who served in Tripoli prior to the revolution. During my 4 visits to Libya, I've spoken with Libyan government officials, military officers, Islamists, and militia leaders across the country, including in Benghazi. At the core of Libya's crisis is the power of its militias, who draw support from a wide array of local, tribal, ethnic, and religious constituencies. Their persistence is rooted in the absence of effective municipal governance, representative institutions, and a strong central army and police. Since 2012, these militias have become politicized. They have used armed force to compel the passage of a sweeping law barring Gaddafi-era officials from the government, kidnapped the Prime Minister, and blockaded oil production in the East. Weapons are now the de facto currency through which demands are pressed and concessions obtained. Militias have also captured illicit trafficking networks. Libya's instability has been aggravated by a decision by the weak transitional government to put the militias on its payroll, under the loose authority of the Ministries of Defense and Interior. The idea then was to harness the manpower of the revolutionaries to fill the security void left by the non-existent army, which was kept deliberately weak by Gaddafi, who feared its potential for coups. By all accounts, this has been a disastrous Faustian bargain. It has attracted new recruits to the militias through the promise of high salaries, and it has given the militia bosses even more political power. That power is especially evident in the East, where Islamist militias demand the removal of Gaddafi-era personnel from state institutions and the implementation of a Sharia-based constitution before they surrender arms. These actors, however, remain on the outer fringes of Libya's politics and security institutions. Overwhelmingly, the country's Islamists reject violence for political means. Faced with the weakness of the central government, an array of informal societal actors, tribal elders, NGOs, municipal councils, and religious authorities have mobilized against the militias, especially radical groups like Ansar al-Sharia. They have demonstrated a societal resilience and a moderation that has kept the country from sliding down the path of civil war. Mr. Chairman, I want to emphasize that every Libyan I spoke with attributed Libya's crisis to the enduring legacy of Gaddafi's rule, rather than the policies or decisions during the NATO-led intervention. It was Gaddafi's 42-year tyranny that deprived Libyans of even a basic role in governance, pitted tribe against tribe and region against region, wrecked the economy, kept the security institutions deliberately weak, and marginalized the eastern part of the country. Overwhelmingly, Libyans remain supportive of the NATO-led operation, and they welcome outside assistance. What are the areas where this assistance can be best applied? Obviously, the most important task is reforming the security sector and training and equipping a new generation of army and police. The U.S. and its allies are currently engaged in just such a project under the auspices of what is known as the General Purpose Force. But in doing so, they must ensure that the ranks of this new force are inclusive of Libya's diverse tribes and region, and that effective civilian oversight is in place, so that political factions do not capture the new security entities as their personal militias. It is important to recognize that lasting security cannot be achieved without addressing the economic and political motives that drive support for the militias. The government has tried with various schemes to disarm, demobilize, and integrate the young men of the militias. None of these efforts has succeeded because the country is paralyzed between opposing political factions. Each side sees any movement on the security sector as a win for its rivals. In essence, Libya suffers from a balance of weakness amongst its factions and militias. No single entity can compel the others through coercion, but every entity is strong enough to veto the others. With this in mind, the ultimate solution for Libya's woes lies in the political realm, in the drafting of a constitution, the reform of its elected legislature, and a broad-based reconciliation under the auspices of the national dialogue. These are areas where outsiders can lend advice and measured assistance, but where the ultimate burden must be borne by Libyans themselves. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. General Lovell, you were not on this or the Armed Services Committee's primary list of people that were interviewed in this process, and yet you came forward here today, came forward to the committee. Could you explain to us why you believe it was necessary to come forward to offer us your testimony?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I came forward because as a retired officer, most importantly, having served a number of years, I felt it was my duty to come forward. The young men and women that serve in uniform, those that serve along with us in civilian clothes, the circumstances of what occurred there in Benghazi that day need to be known. And with all of the discussion that ensues over a full forthcoming to the American people, it's important. It's a duty to be here.
Thank you. Our committee has interviewed a number of people, including those downrange, people both in Libya and in Benghazi. But as I said earlier, we for the most part, have not interviewed people at AFRICOM, the exception, of course, being General Ham, although Carter Ham was at the Pentagon on September 11th. Do you believe it is appropriate for us to interview other officers and enlisted personnel that served with you in Stuttgart that day as part of our discovery of what they believe could have been done, not just in what we military people call the two shop, but also in the three shop and so on?
Sir, I think if it's any information that gives the most well-rounded picture of the occurrences of the time are important to obtain.
One of the questions as we fan out here, but one of the questions that I have for you is your primary job is in fact knowing the risk, knowing who the bad guys are and where they are, and knowing what might face them. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So your expertise is not in the operational response of what refuelers were where and could have reacted within a certain amount of time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
However, you were intimately familiar with the risk of extremist groups in Egypt, Libya, and throughout the North Africa, and for that matter, all of Africa. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, African Command basically doesn't have any jets. It doesn't have any conventional divisions. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you leverage all the other commands when you need physical boots on the ground. Is that right?
Boots on the ground, planes in the air, ships in the sea, et cetera. Right.
However, the role of African Command, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, so please correct me if I'm even a little off,
I will.
Is in fact to look at a continent in which we have almost no troops and almost no basing. We have a small joint base in Djibouti, I believe, but for the most part we have no military assets, major military assets in Africa. Is it fair to say that counterterrorism, looking for and being aware and working with the governments in Africa, with or without, if necessary, to combat terrorism and, in fact, to make sure that governments are stable and able to support our missions, USAID and the aid missions and the embassies. Is that really, to a great extent, why there's a unique command with 4-star general in charge of it that focuses on this continent of 1 billion people, larger than North America?
That's precisely the understanding. It's to help Africans, and to work with Africans and our other partners to do so.
So, in that role, on September 11th, earlier, there was an attack in Egypt. Did you know of, anticipate, or do you believe that the attack in Egypt was based on seeing a YouTube video?
Personally, no.
So that never came to you, even though intelligence and what may have caused something would have been right up your, if you will, alley?
Yes, sir.
And in the hours that ensued after the attack on our consulate compound in Benghazi, did you hear YouTube video?
Briefly discussed, but not from any serious standpoint.
And what time did you first hear that there was a video, roughly?
It was early on in the evening of September 11th.
Before 3:15 in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, we were absolutely. I would have to say probably dismissed that notion by then by working with other sources.
Okay, I just want to follow up with this one last thing. You heard about this early on, and you, as the deputy and the highest-ranking person that moment working these issues, you dismissed the idea that this attack was, in fact, a demonstration that went awry and was based on a YouTube video out of Los Angeles.
Yes, sir. Short answer.
Thank you. Recognize the ranking member.
Thank you very much. More than 3 years ago, a wave of political change swept through the Middle East and North Africa. This Arab Spring promised hope for people oppressed by dictators for decades, but it also led to abrupt change and sometimes bloody conflicts. I'm looking forward to hearing about how this movement has evolved over the last 3 years and how the United States can support a peaceful democratic transition in the region. I'd also like to focus on the choice our country faced when the uprising against dictator Muammar Gaddafi began in 2011. At that time, the United States could have done nothing and allowed Gaddafi to remain in power, or we could have supported the liberation of the people of Libya. At the time, both Republicans and Democrats called on the President to support the rebels and oust Gaddafi. For example, on April 24, 2011, Senator Lindsey Graham said this, and I quote, "You cannot protect our vital national interests if Gaddafi stays." General Lovell, and I want to thank you for coming forward, I really do. Do you agree with Senator Graham and that Gaddafi was a threat to our national security?
Yes, I do.
And Dr. Straight, how about you? Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
And I think you, a little bit earlier, agreed with me that there are things that we need to do to be supportive of the government. What would those things be, Doctor? The present situation.
There are several things. First, as several panelists mentioned, helping establish a Libyan national army that can actually police Libya's territory, rein in the militia as you begin to get political solutions to problems that will permit their disarmament. Second, support and help structure and help organize civil society and elections in Libya. We are doing much, much, much too little in helping the Libyans move a political process forward. And we do that largely with examples, our own example, but also what all of us know about democratizing societies. We know how to do this, we're just not doing it nearly enough.
Now, well, 3 months later, on July 3, 2011, Senator John McCain stated, and I quote, if Gaddafi stays, it is then a direct threat to our national security. Dr. Gardenstein-Ross, what's your view, and did you agree with Senators McCain and Graham?
I do not, sir.
Okay.
Gaddafi was a brutal dictator. Nobody should have tears for him. But he was also about as rehabilitated as a dictator could be. I think that the statement that he threatened our national security would have been very true in the 1980s, true in the 1990s, but by 2011, he was at most a third or fourth tier security concern, in my view.
So therefore, you disagreed with the senators?
Yes, I do, sir.
All right. Dr. Rary, do you agree with the senators?
Well, I believe that Gaddafi was keeping a lid on a lot of things that were brewing. I mean, he was probably not a direct security threat the way he was in the 80s, but it depends on how we define security. I mean, many of the ills that spilled over from Libya and the current problems of Libya were because of his rule, because of the way he kept things, clamped down, didn't permit civil society, marginalized the East. I mean, the seeds of extremism were sown during his regime. So in that sense, it was a security threat, I think. And we know that Libyans were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, so he was exporting a lot of those problems beyond his borders.
And what do you think we should be doing? What steps should the United States be taking to improve the situation in Libya?
Well, I think under the circumstances, the U.S. is doing quite a lot with other partners in Europe and elsewhere. The U.S. is committed to train over 19,000 new Libyan soldiers as part of the General Purpose Force, along with Turkey, Britain, Italy, and Morocco. This proposal is underway. We're engaged in civil society. Much of this is the problem is the lack of a partner on the other side. There's such disarray in the Libyan government that we can't really interface with them. So, for instance, the Libyan government has not agreed to provide payment for the General Purpose Force, which is why we're unable to move forward with this training of the new army. But during my 4 travels to Libya since the revolution, I found the international community has been engaged, and the U.S. is there in terms of reforming the defense sector, helping with ministerial oversight, reaching out to Libya's vibrant civil society. A lot of this, the problem is access. I mean, the security situation doesn't permit our diplomats to go out and reach Libyans.
And Brigadier General Lovell, what would you have us do there now to make the situation better in Libya?
Well, sir, no longer serving and having access to a lot of the pertinent information and data, I wouldn't be able to give you a strong military answer to that. My personal answer to that would be one where it's a set of circumstances where we would have to work together to develop. That development would have to be very engaged on the ground with the people to make that happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd ask unanimous consent just to put something on the record at this time. Our records show that for agreed to be made public that we have interviewed, as I said, the Supreme Commander, or the Combatant Commander, General Ham. We've also interviewed the Vice Commander, the Admiral Leidick, Admiral Landro, and Losey, Admiral Losey, or Rear Admiral Losey, who's the SOC commander. Would you agree to provide the committee additional suggestions of the people that, from your recollection, are outside of this hearing so that it not be public, the people you believe would be most helpful to gain knowledge directly of the facts on the ground on that day?
Yes, sir.
Of course.
Of the list of people that we have already interviewed, I'm sure you're familiar with those titles. Would they be people that would be able to render an opinion like you were able to? And I'm not saying you would come up with the same conclusion, but would have the same type of information to render an opinion. These are people who are our public servants, who are military people. So I'm just curious.
Sir, I know each of those gentlemen and served with
them. And what
them.
do you think of them?
They're fine officers.
Mm-hmm. And so would they be in a position to render an opinion as you have?
Yes, sir.
Very well.
Okay. So I think we've established that we'll get additional names and that the names we've already interviewed would be ones that would have been on your list.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And I thank the gentleman from Florida who is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Lovell, a couple of questions. First of all, I think you have testified that we knew the night of September 11th that this was not just say there was results of some of the video that had been shown, that we knew this wasn't just a demonstration. We knew this was a concerted attack.
Yes, I did.
Okay. That being said, it would be in your position, you would know who sort of knew what. The State Department would also have known pretty instantaneously that there was a pretty serious incident going on in Benghazi. I've seen videos of it. Some of that's transmitted into the State Department and other locations. So we had a pretty good idea of what was going on there. You did. Would you say the State Department should have or could have?
They could or should, yes, sir.
Okay. The attack started at 9:40, which was 3:40 in the afternoons here, approximately 6-hour difference, I think. That about correct?
Yes.
So it wasn't an unusual time here in the United States. The appropriate people and the highest level people should have been alerted that something serious is going on at one of our posts. Is that correct?
It was during the duty day here in the United States, yes, sir.
Yeah. I don't know if we could have saved the ambassador and aide that was with him. They may have been killed in the smoke and or the first part of that. Would you say that was a pretty good assumption that they were not? It was not possible to save them because they were probably killed within an hour or two. The U.S. really doesn't have the capability of responding there now. Not that we shouldn't have had on the ground the capability to respond to some kind of attack. Would that be a correct assumption?
You would typically greatest desire for whatever situation you were going to be in to have adequate security.
And I know we have over 100 posts, and there were about 14 listed on, sort of the endangered or high-risk list, and Benghazi was one of them. Isn't that correct?
You would have to look to the State Department for the list. I don't have
we were
knowledge.
told that in the past, and so someone failed. They failed to have the proper protections with a post at risk. You don't have, every post doesn't have the same risk. Every point we don't have the same risk, but that was one of the major ones. The time frame didn't allow us maybe to save the ambassador because they came in and attacked. It was an attack. It wasn't a little demonstration in the street. I believe we had enough time to save the two former Navy SEALs that were trying to protect the post. That they were killed at approximately 5:15 a.m. It started at 9:40. That's a good 6 hours. I've been to Italy, I've been to Spain, I've been to Turkey, I've been to Stuttgart. I was informed as a member of Congress, if we had an incident, this is before Benghazi, that we could respond. We had the capability of responding in a short order to save American personnel, particularly an ambassador or key assets or American citizens. From points, and North Africa isn't exactly the toughest spot. There are places deeper in Africa that are tougher to get to. But I believe we could have saved those two if someone had taken action. Do you think we have the ability to do that?
Presently or at the time?
At the time.
At the time, it didn't happen that way, and others have discussed the
Did the United States of America have the ability to protect its, again, people at that post within 6 hours?
The The State Department would be responsible for the time on the ground. Military